I want to introduce Lynne and see how's the sound, okay? Lynne Tillman's memoir, Mothercare, on obligation, love, death, and ambivalence. This? Yeah. Like that, okay. Is an elegiac, elegantly written recollection of 11 plus years, maddening caretaking, advocating for her mother with doctors and hospitals, and when the hired caretakers were off on weekends, performing the nauseating task of emptying the commode. That's a very old-fashioned word, by the way. Love and death in a time of seizures and brain shunts. Ambivalence is the tell in the subtitles list of nouns. Punctuated with fraught childhood memories and mini traumas, the story Tillman unpacks is of a daughter caring for a mother who remained narcissistic, competitive, brutal, and who, in her early 90s, confesses she misses sex and her cat. The cat, Griselda, appears on the book jacket, casting her shadow over the cover and over the entire memoir, standing in as the central love object of Sophie Merrill's long life. At 6 years old, Lynne Tillman was aware that, quote, she disliked her mother, but I didn't wish her dead. At 8, she discovered her ice blue parakeet lying headless on the floor. Her mother's cat had magically opened the door where the bird was flying free. Her mother drove the cat to a shelter where it bolted its cage and presumably suicided in the traffic. Sophie never forgot her. Mother care, mother hate, and mother love are the complex emotional terrains traversed in this carefully documented account of Sophie as she lay dying. The memoir asks, should the offspring of difficult mothers, even abusive ones, feel guilty or obligated to take care of their mothers in their last years? The temptation to give back what as mothers they dished out. Does a daughter who has suffered owe that parent devotion and caring at the end? Once an accomplished horsewoman and tennis player whose grammar was perfect and who passed as a full-blooded American, betraying none of her upbringing on the Lower East Side, mother, and that's with a capital M, hangs over her daughter's life, quote, like a drone or a Macy's float on parade day. That was stricken at 86 with a hard-to-diagnose syndrome that produces excess fluid in the brain. Her 3 daughters discover she now stares at the world around her, lacking comprehension, loses her memory, and replaces her normal fastidiousness with unkempt hair and lack of bodily control. Pill lists and times, a parade of caregivers, including the long-serving Frances who steals, doctors disagreeing on diagnoses, brain scans, time wasted figuring out what her mother's brain was doing, populate the essay's main section. The reader receives shock therapy in the form of blunt statements. Sometimes this is a quote, sometimes I imagined I loved her, she loved me, illusions helped me cope. About 6 weeks before Sophie passed, the battle lines of mother-daughter competition and creative strivings reappear. Tillman's mother told her, if I had wanted to be, I would have been a better writer than you. This will to power at age 98 bespeaks a woman born in 1908 who wanted to write, paint, and express her imaginative capabilities, and who resented her daughter's success and fame as a writer. Tillman writes, mother envied all of her 3 daughters, and she was jealous of her husband and of anyone he loved. In the end, Tillman says she really didn't know her mother, and that she would never know unconditional mother love or a good or good enough mother. David Winnicott, the psychotherapist who invented that phrase, the good enough parent, attributed a child's despair to the consequence of a parent's cruel and counterproductive perfectionism. Sophie thought of herself as perfect, her cat was perfect, and her own mother was perfect. Tillman didn't buy it. Someone whose mother loved her, I felt, whose mother was perfect, whatever that might be, wouldn't treat her own children the way mother did. That's what I thought and think. Parent memoirs are complicated. Whether Catherine Harrison's The Kiss, in which a daughter relates her incest tale involving her pastor father, Jeanette McCurdy's recent best-selling title shocker, I'm Glad My Mother Died, the author posing with a pink funeral urn on the cover, or The Still Position, a poetic memoir by a woman who literally lists her mother's intimate crimes and petty misdemeanors over 3 pages, are volumes that raise questions about the etiquette of daughters telling secrets and engaging in emotional bloodletting. In Lynne's case, she always kept it classy while telling her truth. Lynne Tillman.
Thank you. I'm going to read a little bit from this book, and it's just a section to give you a taste of the writing. In the early days, we daughters worked to discover how best to help her. Mother was considered an unusual medical case. Maybe there was new research for old problems. Her condition is normal pressure hydrocephalus. One depressing misadventure. I took Mother for evaluation by a research group on aging and dementia affiliated with her hospital. Their rooms were situated in a dismal basement, a project noticeably underfunded, the way aging itself was then, and could be still, and noticeably understudied. They tested and videotaped her. Mother wasn't a perfect NPH candidate, normal pressure hydrocephalus candidate, because her gait was never an NPH gait. It's a kind of walk that is associated with this condition. She did well in their terms on some tests and badly on others. During all her visits, her responses did not consistently fit their parameters for NPH. The researchers were unenthusiastic, dull men who viewed Mother as an object of study. Brain damage had made her remarkably compliant. She was not belligerent the way she mostly had been. And seeing her attempt to do what they asked of her, walk a straight line, remember these words, was heartrending, even pathetic, especially since she mattered to them only as she confirmed or disconfirmed their theories. They didn't believe she had NPH. When Mother walked better, attended the theater with her caregiver, or took the bus to Bloomingdale's to buy a suit, pale pink, for her upcoming birthday, made jokes, was painting or reading, when she recovered capacity in ways that were medically unexpected, I imagined returning with her to those dull researchers. She would show them they had no idea what they had seen. They had no idea how to test anyone. It remained a fantasy, just as suing Dr. Z, the arrogant neurologist, did. Some days I wanted to take everyone to court. A godless Job, poor me, why did this have to happen? A put upon by life feeling, yeah, poor me, poor everyone. And here are 2 quotes, one from D.H. Lawrence and one from George Gissing. I never saw a wild thing sorry for itself. A small bird will drop frozen dead from a bough without ever having felt sorry for itself. And from Gissing, life, I fancy, would very often be insupportable, but for the luxury of self-compassion. The brain grows new cells. The way the shunt drained fluid, more or less, from 1 hour to the next, affected her physically and mentally. I should tell you that the shunt was discovered or invented in the 1960s by an engineer, not a medical doctor, whose child was born with normal pressure hydrocephalus. And the thing about the shunt is that they put it in, it attaches to the brain, and it is shunts out fluid, but it often gets stopped up. So it often misfires, doesn't work, backs up, causes problems, and then they do a procedure to fix it. My mother had 1 implantation and 6 procedures to fix it, each time going into her body. And the last time, I think she was 96. She died at 98. She was constitutionally very strong, actually. The way the shunt drained fluid more or less from 1 hour to the next affected her physically and mentally. Some days she was remarkably lucid, some days she wasn't. Some days she walked better. We figured it had to do with the flow of cerebral fluid. She did have some permanent brain damage from the pressure before the shunt was implanted and from when it wasn't working. If it wasn't working, all her symptoms reappeared, and if not redone, she would go back to 0. Dr. Z, the arrogant neurologist who is dead, laughed at our concerns and told us the shunt was working when it wasn't. It may have been right to sue him for malpractice, but I thought then and told my New York sister it would absorb more of our time, our flagging spirits and energy, and crush us more than we were. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe we should have. But he's dead. Mother had an appointment with her new neurologist, Dr. D, affiliated with the neurosurgeon's hospital, and initially he seemed dubious. Mother could make progress. At first, it was dubious that Mother could make progress. At first he struck me as dour, even grim, not particularly engaged with her. During a second or third visit, Mother was completely inattentive, not talking, not at all lucid. This was during that very bad stretch after her 3rd revision. That's what those procedures are called, a revision. The Carolina sister was right beside me, across from Dr. D. By now she spent 1 weekend every 6 to 8 weeks with Mother. I asked, "Isn't there anything you can do? Anything? Can't you try something?" Mother's 8 months of immobility, a kind of semi-comatose state, were desperate days. Can't you give her something to help her brain? Dr. D thought. His forehead actually wrinkled. Maybe Ritalin, he said. It can activate aging brains. After taking Ritalin for 2 weeks, Mother spoke again. When we brought her back to him, she was so changed, he was startled. Seeing her renewed liveliness and humor, he became playful with her, and she responded. Mother liked men. Helpers are critically important in getting the best out of doctors, aides, hospitals. It's critical to be bold. Your charges can't defend or help themselves. Critical to do your own research, to encourage doctors to explore and try other and different techniques, tactics, ideas. The elderly especially are seen as dead weight to the medical industry. Not all doctors dismiss them, but some do. Their cases can be depressing. Many don't get better. Some can improve and lead better lives. I'll just stop there.
Oops. So I had a couple of questions I wanted to start with, and then I'll open it up to the students and members of the community or who are here. And my first question has to do with the motive for memoir. And that is, what was your motive in writing about caring, first of all, caring for a mother for whom you had some ambivalent feelings, and then writing about it?
Well, I first should say I don't think it's a memoir. It's an autobiographical essay. And I make that distinction because if it were a memoir, I wouldn't be talking about my mother's doctors. I wouldn't be talking about all kinds of things that I do, because it wasn't my life per se. When I started it, it was a year after my mother died, and I had just finished, a novel of mine had just come out, and I had this time. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll write an essay about what happened to my mother. I thought I'd just write about the doctors and the hospitals. And I was 14 pages in when I realized I didn't want to write this down. My mother had just died. I didn't want to live through it again. And so I waited and wrote other things. And when I finished another novel, and it came out in 2018, called Men and Apparitions, I thought, okay, I'll go back to Mothercare, which I'd already named it. And COVID came along, and the lockdown was, for many writers, helpful, oddly. Well, it was also horrifying. And I worked on it then, and I finished it then. And it's an essay. It's an autobiographical essay. It is about my life. It's written, I write about my mother from my point of view. But again, the story that I'm telling is very, very far from what I would consider a memoir. Mm-hmm. And why did I write it? Well, my first impulse had to do with what I had learned. And what you recognize when someone you care about gets ill, very seriously ill, is that you don't know what to do. You don't know anything. You know, you begin an exploration of who's the best doctor, what does she need, what is this condition, all of these questions, and you're on a research mission. You don't want to be a person who just takes every doctor's word for it. Much as there are many, many good doctors, the best ones have doubt themselves, especially with a condition that's unusual, like my mother's was, although it's much better known now. So my sisters and I went through a day-to-day life that none of us ever expected. I mean, you don't expect this ever in your life, and of course it's going to happen. Something like this is going to happen to all of us. If there's anything universal in the world, this is universal. People get ill, they need help, and then they die. And this stretched out over 11 years. I learned a lot. I might have done some things very differently if I had known what I knew at the end, but I didn't know it. And I thought that I could write something about this ordeal that was unsentimental. It is very unsentimental. That might help other people. You know, I'm not saying I'm the most altruistic person in the world. I'm not. But I had all this information and this experience. And the one thing writers do is they use whatever they have to write. And that's why I did it. It's much less in my mind now that I've written this book.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good idea to open things up at this point to students or anyone else, but who has questions? Yes.
I actually have a bunch of questions.
Could you stand up?
I have a bunch of questions actually now that you've been talking. But one thing I really wanted to know was specifically you said you knew you disliked your mother.
Yeah.
Let's give you a mic. Or come up to the front.
Come to the front. Thanks. So you said at age 6 you knew you disliked your mother. Is there a specific event that triggered that moment that you knew right then and there that you just
Wasn't a specific event, no.
There wasn't?
No.
Can I do a couple? Is that okay?
Go.
Okay. One of the things I'm very similar with is my grandfather died, and one of my mother's biggest regrets was never suing the hospital because it was their fault for his death. And you mentioned that you wanted to sue the neurologist. Do you regret never suing the neurologist, even if it wasn't for the money, just so it was on his record?
It wasn't about money.
Yeah, it was just like the
Do
record.
I regret it? You know, that's...
Oh,
sorry. I'm doing to you what I was... It's a good question, and it's a question for which I really don't have an answer. This went on for 6 or 8 months. I mean, you'll read about it in the book if you read the book. And he kept saying that her shunt was working, and that we weren't recognizing her, that it was an aging brain. And for many, many reasons, we knew it wasn't just an aging brain and that the shunt wasn't working. But he kind of made fun of us when we would bring her in. He did a spinal tap every time we brought her in, months and months.
Yeah.
And when there was less fluid,
Sure.
by the way, I used to be terrified of that idea, the spine, but it's not that big a deal. I mean, done by somebody who knows how to do it.
Yeah.
But whenever some of that fluid was removed, she was more lucid immediately. So finally, we waited too long, and it was not good for my mother's brain. Finally, we heard about a neurosurgeon who did a lot of work on normal pressure hydrocephalus. In fact, he often did surgeries on children. We went to him and we said, we think the shunt is not working. He said, well, let's give her the test. He said, the test? There's a test for this? He said, oh yes, the shuntogram, which was, kind of hilarious. The next morning I brought my mother in. She had the shuntogram, and indeed, there was a way of knowing that the shunt wasn't working. That this neurologist, who was the head of a big hospital in neurology, didn't call for the test was horrible, and it was something that he could have been sued for.
Yeah, that's what happened with my grandfather. He had a surgery done, he had a bad heart, had a knee replacement, and after the surgery was done, no painkillers, no antibiotics, the hospital did horrible care, and so that was one of my mother's biggest regrets, was never suing the doctor for that.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so I'm very sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Someone else?
You want?
I can bellow
Okay,
too.
bellow.
Island, you can hear me, right?
Yes,
You will
very
hear me.
easily.
I have two things came to mind. The first is Burke's great phrase, literature is equipment for living. And the second is William Carlos Williams, the poet and the doctor, says that the writer needs to develop ethical attachment. It's really striking in the response to the question. I detect in the unsentimental and it's really a claim for a kind of knowledge and preparation in the face of death. Has that helped you to write this? I mean, I distinctly recall watching my mother watch her mother die and resenting my grandmother so for how she behaved. And it's not something we've ever been able to talk about, in part because my mother's attitude is, what would be the point of that? So I'm wondering about the writing of an essay in such a way and how that does relate to the significant ethical quandary.
I think the book is entirely about ethics.
Good.
I think, how we handled the situation, how we could have done it better, how the doctors behaved, all of these are ethical questions. And one of my ethical questions to myself was, or not a question, a statement to myself was, be as honest as possible. Do not make yourself heroic. You're not the saddest person in the world. Be as honest as you can be, and be as straightforward in the writing. A review recently that came out in The Nation by a woman whose last name is, young woman, literary critic, Moses is her last name. She made a very interesting interpretation or statement that taught me something. She said that she knew other books of mine. She said in other books of Lynne, she makes associations to other ideas or to other books or to movies and so on, and that I never do that in this and in Mothercare, and that's true. And it was because there was nothing that this brought to mind except what was going on. I was kind of locked into this situation, And if you've ever been in this situation, you know how it feels like a tunnel. There's nothing outside it. When you go into a hospital or when you're in a sick room, there's nothing outside that. That's all that exists. It's very, very stark. And so the book is stark, I think. Thank you.
So it's mostly focused on, mother-daughter relations,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I felt like the book was also a critique of the American healthcare industry. Did you intend to make it so? And you also acknowledged your privilege in the beginning of the novel. Do you think that the American healthcare system and your privilege worked positively or negatively?
Good question. It's not mostly a mother-daughter story, I don't think, although that is one of the main aspects to it. It's more like a life and death story, or living through some horrible 11 years with a mother who's ill. A critique would have been somewhat different from mine, but handling the facts of the situation, and facts, of course, interpreted through my point of view, just putting that out there is enough of its own critique in that sense. The things that happened, the way in which one time taking my mother to the emergency room at NYU, and her getting lost in the hallway. She was on a gurney somewhere and no one could find her. Well, that seems a pretty horrible thing. It's not the worst thing that could have happened. I mean, she could have been lost forever, but also the way in which, without Medicare, I don't know how we would have dealt with things. We were very, very fortunate to have that, so I do have a paragraph in there about its importance. I thought it was important to say that. Of course, now it's always under attack, which is a horrible thing, along with Social Security. My privilege was in having been, apart from other things, educated. And educated enough so that I could come up against doctors, that I could say something to doctors. I wasn't so intimidated. I could say, why are you giving my mother this medication? Does it fit with the other medication she's taking? I could ask questions. I could doubt things. I wasn't simply passive. And I think that having had an education and speaking the same language and understanding what they were saying, or being able to ask, what the hell do you mean, by saying that, comes out of the privilege I had to be sent to college, let's say, and and do some grad school as well. Yes. Thank you.
On this side, students, anyone? Yes.
So on the question, I guess, of ethics, I guess, how do you balance writing about family or difficult parent relationships, especially if your family doesn't want you writing about them? So I guess, how do you balance, because you're very, as you had mentioned, critical of your mother, but I know that, whenever I try writing about my mother, she's like, don't write about me. But she knows what to do anyway. So I guess I'm curious, how you balance that, and also the expectations, I guess, from your own family.
I hope if people read it, they'll see that I make an effort in the writing to show ways in which I thought my mother was interesting and more than competent, and she did certain things in life that I admired her for. I don't just simply tear her down. That wasn't my object. But what was my object was to say, I didn't like my mother. I don't think I loved my mother. In fact, I don't think I loved my mother. Nonetheless, I found myself helping to take care of her. And that to me is an interesting,
Yeah.
is interesting. In other words, you don't have to love someone in order to care for them, which may sound strange or not strange, but it was part of my, I guess, conscience, my superego, whatever it was. I didn't just leave my mother in the gutter, so to speak. My mother died. I didn't write this while she was alive. That's one thing. And one of my sisters has stopped speaking to me. She hasn't read the book. The other one really liked it. So I was aware that this sister who's furious with me would be, and not because of the way I wrote it, just that I wrote it. And yet I wrote it because I thought it was an important thing for me to write. I had gained certain knowledge. I thought I wanted to say that, and maybe it's just the narcissism of a writer or whatever you want to call it. I didn't go into this to destroy anyone. I went in to explore those 11 years honestly, and perhaps it's helpful to people who read it. Does that answer? Yeah. By the way, my mother read my first full-length novel, and it's in segments, and there's a character who really is based on her. She didn't see it. She read it twice, in fact. She told me she didn't see it. So. Yeah.
So for me personally, writing has been like very therapeutic for me, just to get like my feelings and emotions off the page. When you wrote this, did writing it itself help heal past wounds that you had from the situation, or allow any more type of closure that you didn't have, or did it do a little bit of the opposite?
It certainly was not therapeutic. And for therapy, I actually have an analyst, and I've been in some form of psychoanalytic psychotherapy pretty much my entire adult life. I know some people think of therapy, think of writing as therapeutic. That's not what it was for me. I wrote this very much the way I would write fiction. It was a story I was telling. It's a non-fiction novel, you could say, although it's not in cold blood. I didn't kill anybody. So I know for some people it is, but not for me.
We can take a few more questions. I wanted to mention also that books are for sale here in the back of the room, and you'll have an opportunity to get books signed, and you can also speak with the author. I see a hand up over there. Okay, I
There's
see two
one
hands up. What's that? She raised her hand.
So I was just wondering if before and after writing the autobiographical essay, if the perception of your mother changed, and if writing it and having everything in front of you and looking at everything once more, because you said you wrote it after she passed away, so did it change anything for you?
No, not really. It raised, as I was writing it, and figuring out how to write it, it raised questions because I had to choose which words I would use about her. But I don't think my perceptions were changed, no.
Do you have a question?
Hi. So I read online, but Professor Valentis also mentioned in the beginning, it it was brought up that before your mother passed, she had said to you one time, if I wanted to be, I would have been a better writer than you.
Yeah.
Did her words come in mind when you were writing Mothercare, and did they influence how you wrote it at all?
Well, it's a good question. I knew my mother was competitive for a very long time. That she was so bold as to say that to me before she died. About a month, I think, 6 weeks or a month before she died, she was just absolutely lucid, was stunning. And I said to her after she said that, I was sitting on the bed, and I said, you know, Mother, it's not so, I mean, I was very nice about it. I was so stunned. I said, you know, Mother, it's not so nice to be so competitive with your daughter. And she said, I am competitive. And those were the last words she ever said to me. And people have said to me, how great that she actually told you or something, or, you know, it confirmed what you thought. But I'm still stunned. I know that parents obviously are not perfect and all of that, but I still wonder at the depth of her insecurity, anger, her having so many obstacles in her life, her being really envious of her daughters who had a better life than she had. I think we were much better taken care of. She came from a very poor family on the Lower East Side, you know. But, you know, some parents want more for their children, and I think it was very hard for her that we had more than she had, which is, she was a human being with a lot of sadnesses about her, I think. But I was very much aware that I would at some point get to that, although I did wonder if I was actually going to put it in the book sometimes. Thank you for the question.
Bill.
I just wondered about the Ritalin. When they gave it to her, did they say anything that there was a negative, anything negative about the response that her body to the Ritalin, and what ailments that she had?
No, the neurologist said, I mean, it was kind of just a last thought, sort of. Maybe Ritalin would help because it does activate an aging brain. The way it sort of works in the opposite way with children. It kind of settles them. With the aging brain, it helps spark it, activate it, and it did. There were absolutely no negative effects from it. But then she didn't have Alzheimer's. You know, she didn't have that virus, that disease. She had something else, you know.
Since the craft talk, I'll throw a craft question at you. Thank you so much, Lynn and Mary, and so great to see some of my students from World of Writing, and we love this class. How did you go about creating this? Did you have notebooks? Did you have medical records? Did you try to interview your sisters and mother or tape record them? Was it recreated all from memory?
Mostly.
How fallible do you think your memory could be, possibly?
Oh, I think it could have been fallible. I don't keep a diary in the sense that I write out everything, but I might put down, take Mother to Dr. So-and-so today. Also, I gathered up all of the calendars, those calendars with the squares, where her caregiver would write in. So I had certain details that were written out. And I grabbed a couple of notebooks of my mother's, which had almost nothing in them, and I report what they say. But mostly it was my memory, and the sister with whom I still have a relationship, I let her read the book in manuscript. because I knew, well, she had also been an editor, and she knew how to read a book, even one that would include herself. Although they are not named, no one is named, and the people who help my mother, the home care people, are given. They're not named. They're given other names to distinguish them. And when I sent it to the sister, the Carolina sister, I call her, she read it very closely. Fortunately, she was happy with it, and she said, "You just left out a couple of times that I was doing something, so if you don't mind, And of course I didn't. And she had a detail that I'd forgotten, which was one time coming to the hospital, coming up from Carolina to New York, I was on the floor, sitting on the floor in the hallway weeping, which I did not remember, and that struck her, so I was able to add that detail. But mostly, I think I got the facts, those kinds of facts, meds and all of that, and again, it was my interpretation of other things, my point of view.
One of the things that you bring up is the ethics of the caretakers and the ethics of caretaking and having them be part of some of the larger questions that we're dealing with now with race and all that. I thought that was a great broadening of your essay.
Well, it was critically important. We could not have done this without the help of other people, and because of the inequities in our country, often people of color, undocumented immigrants take these jobs, and these jobs are grueling. They're absolutely very, very difficult. And usually people are underpaid. We couldn't afford to pay as much as a U.S. citizen would get on a minimum wage or $20 an hour, whatever it is. And we never had anybody living in our house taking care of anything. And it becomes it's a situation unlike any I have ever known. And it's so complicated. It's not ever simple. And I think that was one of the most jarring aspects to this. Their life and your life, your family's life, get intermingled, very complex. And it's never felt completely comfortable to me, no matter who was working for us. It's very, very difficult, and I wish this country could figure out a healthcare system that included taking care of whether it's care for little babies so their mothers can go to work, or care for the elderly when there isn't anyone to help them. It's just appalling, but I'm not telling you anything you don't know, so.